10 steps pro artists use in their art process. Thank you for joining me. If you hear a little bit of bells or something in the background, that's just my cat very actively running around in the background. So this class is aimed at artists who are beginner to intermediate, want to improve their process and get better results, or who want to do art commissions professionally. Maybe you want to become a freelance artist and want to take on more professional clients and do artwork for clients. There may be some ideas that you can grab from this because a lot of this is going to be talking about process. And as we go through this, I'm going to talk about, if you're working with clients, some tips that you can use when working with clients. So who am I? Who the heck am I? Is this person talking here on the screen? I'm Bogus Red. I go by Bogus Red online, but my real name is Susie Sahim. I'm the founder of paperdemon.com. It's an art and writing community. We host art role-playing games to help motivate creators to become more awesome. I used to work for Google as a Google Doodler, so I used to do art professionally. I created I think it was over 100 Google logos for celebrating various holidays. I'm also the lead artist for the Paper Demon Art RPG, and I've also have some experience leading teams of artists for a project that I've done in the past. So what are we going to cover today? Here's a quick look at what all these 10 steps are, and then I'm going to go through in detail on what each of these is. Okay, let's jump into it. What is number one? Number one is gather requirements. You'll notice that, let me jump back real quick. You'll notice these first two stages, you're not even drawing anything yet. But number one is gather requirements. This is especially important if you're doing any sort of commission work. In this example I'm showing here, I was commissioned to do a series of illustrations for a card game called Gosh Darn Bubbles. So for this project, I needed to know what the requirements were. How is the art going to be appearing? Is it going to be appearing in print? Is it going to be appearing online? Because that's going to impact how the colors are going to be displayed when it's printed. There's a lot less colors that can be used in a printing process versus if it's going to be appearing in a digital medium, such as on a blog or on a website or something. What size does it need to be seen at? What are the goals for the project? What audience is this project for? What are the final deliverables that the client wants? What's the timeline? And especially if this timeline is tied to a specific event, like if your client that you're doing this artwork for, or even if you're doing it for your own project, if you're going to launch this artwork as part of something that's going to launch at a specific event, you know that deadline cannot be moved. So in that case, you may have to prioritize that type of work above other stuff. What's the budget? How are you going to negotiate payment schedule and everything like this? And any special requirements. So in this case, the client had special requirements in terms of how the artwork was created so that it can appear within these cards for this card game. And so when you are working in a professional setting with a client, what you'll want to do is create a brief. I don't have a good example to show you here. You want to create a document that basically has all of these questions on it, and then would have your client, your customer, fill it all out. Now we're going into number two, which is research. After you've gathered all the requirements for what this project is going to be for. So in this part of the process, you'll want to gather as much information, as much imagery as you can to help inspire your process of creating art for this project. So this is very common for me before I start on an illustration, to gather a lot of imagery. So if we go back to the example of the card game that I was commissioned to do for this, it was a sea game, underwater themed game, and the game creator wanted a jellyfish, a crab, and otters. And I had never drawn any of those things before. I didn't have experience with those things. So I really needed to spend some time gathering some research. So I found some photographs, I found some other artwork of otters, of jellyfish, of crabs, that kind of thing. You can put this together on a Pinterest board. You can put it together using another app called PureRef. I actually highly recommend PureRef. It's a free app you can download, and what's cool about it is you can set it up so that it appears on top of Photoshop so that you can see your reference photos as you're navigating around Photoshop. So it's really handy. It can zoom and do all these really cool things and organize the images. Once you've gathered all of that reference material, then and only then are you ready to start drawing. And the next step there is to be doing an exploration. So you've gathered some reference images, you know what the requirements are. Now it's time to brainstorm, and that's what the thumbnailing process is. It's basically drawing very small, quick sketches that you spend maybe 2 minutes on. And usually, if you've not done this process before, if this is not a common thing for you, you probably want to try and get to 25 to 50 thumbnails before you end your thumbnailing session. And the reason for that is when you're still new to this thumbnailing process, you may be editing yourself and you'll have an idea in your head, but you don't actually put it down. And then you may not come up with very good results. You may not come up with as exciting or interesting ideas. You want to put down even the dumb ideas, because even those dumb ideas can lead to good ideas. There may be some piece of it that might be interesting to you. And you don't want to spend a lot of time on these, just 1 to 2 minutes per thumbnail. Don't go into detail. You don't have time for that. You just want to be really quick. This is also a great way to explore different compositions, like where things might be placed in the frame. And the reason this is a great stage or a great step to take in your art process is it's very low investment. It would not be very time efficient to spend a lot of time drawing the details of something and then realize, wait a minute, composition doesn't quite work, or the proportions are kind of wrong, or that kind of thing. I have some more examples too for you here. Here's a project I finished recently. This was an illustration I made for the Art RPG. And you can see these are some of the thumbnails that I created for this illustration. So you can see the final artwork is on the right here, and the actual thumbnail, the first thumbnail I created, that of this actual drawing, it looked just like this. You can't even tell really what's going on in there, and that's okay, because these thumbnail sketches are not intended for your client to see. They're not intended for anyone except yourself. So as long as you understand what is going on in this thumbnail, that's all that's important. And you want to keep your drawings really rough and loose so that you can quickly make them. No erasing is needed when you're doing this. After you've done your thumbnailing, you're probably going to pick one of those that you're going to go with. So in this case, I went with this one down here in the middle to do this final illustration. So by thumbnail, do you mean just rough drafts, not the thumbnail you put on a video? That's correct. So it means you're doing little sketches that are really small. If you're doing it on paper, they're only maybe 2 inches wide when you're drawing. So you want to keep it small. And if you keep it small like that, you're going to prevent yourself from getting too invested in it and too involved in detail. And you want to create a bunch of them. You don't want to do just one and then commit to that. The point is to explore different ideas and concepts and compositions for the artwork. Harper says, I tend to include a little note in my thumbnail as I work through it too. That's great too. Yes, putting little notes. If maybe as you were drawing this thumbnail, you had in your mind, oh, I'd want to use this color here or something like that. Or maybe this little squiggle is intended to be something complicated that you can't draw in that moment on that thumbnail. That's a great thing to do, is just write down some little notes. So after that, you've selected a thumbnail for what you're going to use for this drawing. Next, you'd want to go into studies. Now, let me clarify something really quick. I've included in this presentation 10 different steps that pro artists use. I don't want you to think that you have to do all of these steps every time. I don't use these steps every time. It depends on the project needs and the type of illustration that I'm doing. It's up to you to decide whether each of these steps is actually going to be useful for any individual project. Okay, so step 4 is doing studies. So let's say you're going to do something that you've never drawn before, or you're going to use some sort of medium or process that you've never used before. So for an illustration, like if you're going to be drawing certain animals, like in my case, I had to draw otters. I'd never drawn otters before. So I did some sketches of otters first before I started to work on that composition thumbnail that I picked. And it's not intended to create anything that's going to go in the final piece. It's only intended to try and get a feel for the anatomy of the character, the anatomy of the animal, you know, the direction of the fur, the colors maybe. So the intent with the study phase is just to practice what it is that you're trying to include in the final. So this is like a planning step, I guess, or a practice step. So this example that I'm showing here, the final illustration is on the right. This was a watercolor piece that I created for my nephew who was born last year for his nursery. And I was going to use a watercolor technique that I'd never used before to create misty trees. I looked at a tutorial online on how to do watercolor misty pine trees, and so I did some practices on the you can see on the bottom here. I also kind of experimented with how to paint or articulate quickly some foliage. I also kind of experimented a little bit with how to indicate the moon to make it glow. I tried some different techniques that didn't quite work out right, so I ended up using something different for the final. So that's kind of what this phase is for. This is like you're doing some practice and experimentation and study of your subject matter so you can better understand it for the final. Okay, Truly Manly says, that's small. Okay, this reminds me of behind the scenes of Pixar with the storyboards. Yeah, so the processes that are followed here are very similar to what you'd see in an animation studio. So my background, my training is in animation and illustration. So a lot of my classmates that went through the same program that I went through went to work for Pixar, went to work for DreamWorks, went to work for TV animation studios, for video games, all that kind of stuff. So they all use these same steps. Not all of them all the time. Like I said, it really depends on your project. But yeah, so this is kind of showing you what all of this planning stuff goes into each illustration before you get into the final one. Okay, now from here, you've got your thumbnail sketch. And now you're gonna make a more refined or like a rougher sketch. Something that actually can be seen by someone else and they can understand what's going on. So for this particular example, if we're looking at the same example I used in the last one, I had a thumbnail here. You can kind of see what's going on here, but it's kind of confusing. It's not quite clear what these creatures are. It's clear what the trees are, but it's not something I would show to a client to get their review and approval. So I then took it the next step, did a rougher, something that's clearer than the previous sketch to better work out a little bit more of the detail. You may, if you're doing client work, you'd probably pick more than one thumbnail to create a more clearer sketch from. Do or don't use tonal shading depending on the need. And then you'd send these, which, you may send 3 options to your client for review. So let me show you an example of that. For the card game that I talked about earlier, I gave 3 to 4 options for each card. So you can see for the crab card, I gave 4 sketches. So these are a little bit clearer than a thumbnail might look. You can clearly see what the character is, what the elements are in the composition. I gave 3 options for the otters, and I gave 3 options for the jellyfish. Now with the jellyfish, you'll notice I used tone. I used some shading in there. And I did that because I knew that this particular card was going to be, it's meant to be a jellyfish that's lit up. The lighting is essential to this particular illustration. So it made sense for this rough sketch that I sent to the client to include some tone so that it was really clear what it was going to kind of look like compositionally, how it was going to glow and everything like that. But you'll see it's black and white. No time is spent on color or anything. It's just to get the client to see and pick an option. You'll also notice I've got labels A, B, C, D. So it's real easy for the client to be like, I really like the option B for the jellyfish. So you have a clear understanding from them of what they like and what they'd like to go forward with. Here's another example. So this is on the right, the final illustration I created recently for our Eventide campaign. The thumbnail here is on the left. You could barely make out what the hell's going on in there. And then I made went to a rough sketch to kind of make it clear what's going on here. Now, when I'm working digitally, what I will do is I'll actually take this thumbnail and I'll blow it up so that it fills the entire screen. And then, put partial transparency on it and draw on top of it. We're halfway through, and I have to give you the obligatory please like and subscribe if you're finding this video helpful so far. Okay, number 6. We had a rough sketch. Now it's time to refine that some more. Make it a little clearer of what's going on. If this was for a client project, you don't want to proceed to the step until the client has seen it and approved a sketch concept. So, because you don't want to be spending time doing something that isn't going to get used. Because the client may say, I don't like this, or I want you to change that, whatever. So if it's for client work, you want to just wait until the client gets back to you. So, okay, we have a couple questions here. True Manly asks, so for the options, it's good to spend more time on it. It's not just quick, tiny thumbnails for this, correct? Oh, Duskfire. Sorry, I didn't know that was you. So Duskfire, yes. So when you do thumbnails, let me go back real quick. When you're doing thumbnails, these are for you and you alone. And typically, they are not going to be clear enough for a client to see them and review them and understand what's going on. But you know what they are. You can tell what's going on in the sketches because you drew them. You had an image in your head of what they were. So that's why you want to go another step to like an actual sketch. So a rough sketch has a little more refinement in it and is a little clearer what's going on. It depends though. Your thumbnail may be quite clear and you can just use that. So it's up to you. But generally with the thumbnailing, you're only spending 1 to 2 minutes on it. A lot of times it's stick figures. It's really hard to see what's going on in that. Does this work for commissions? If a client likes A more than B, then I should change my pace for that one instead. Yeah, so if you are doing, it depends on how you're doing commissions. Generally, you'd want to give your customer a chance to choose from some options. But if you are more experienced and you charge a higher price, you can say upfront, you're not going to do multiple options. But generally speaking, if you're doing a commission, especially in a professional setting, you would give your client multiple options to choose from, like this. And it doesn't have to be 10. I mean, I know that I said with thumbnailing, you're gonna wanna do 25 to 50, but you wanna just pick, you wanna narrow it down to 3, maybe 4, if you've got a really good one in there. Because you don't wanna give the client too many options, and you wanna make sure you're presenting your best ideas. So here with the refined sketch, you're actually kind of working out some details. You can see on the right here, here's a work in progress phase of the last digital illustration I did. You can see that the refined sketch is in blue and the final line art is in black above it on a separate layer. This is a pretty common process that artists use. Here is the start to finish, thumbnail to rough sketch to refined sketch to final line art to final color for this illustration. So in the upper left, we've got this thumbnail. You can barely tell what the heck is going on. A rough sketch, which is kind of figuring out a little bit more what the forms are. It's starting to feel a little bit more three-dimensional. It's a little bit clearer what's going on. Refined sketch, now you can actually see faces, and then final line art and final color. So the next step is number 7, a value or tonal study. Now, I don't do this. This is one of those steps that I don't do every time. It really depends on the illustration. Especially if it's something where light is really important to the illustration, a tonal study is a common step that I'll take. And I've got a couple more examples I can show you. So all it is you're just working in shades of gray to kind of figure out where's the darks and where's the lights in your illustration. So you can see on the bottom here, this is the finished illustration that I created. And then above here, this is the rough sketch that I had, and then I put tones into it to kind of figure out where's the light, where's the dark, because the light and the dark in these types of illustrations is really important to the composition. And when you're focusing just on the lights and the darks, you don't have color standing in your way. It's a lot easier to think about it. It's much simpler. Harper says, I've gone to full digital, but I used to keep a notebook to do my thumbnails while I took my kids places. It might work to move between digital and traditional for the purpose of multitasking. That's a great point. I love that. Thank you, Harper. Here's a couple more examples. Down here is the finished illustration for Faden, the Faden portal that we had for our Art RPG. And down here, this is the Eventide portal. And I began these with tonal studies to figure out where the light is going to be, what's the composition. Going on to the next step, color comps. So I don't know about you, but color is a very important part of my illustrations. But I have a hard time deciding what colors to use because I love them all. So one of the things that I do is I do something called color comping, where you take your sketch, you duplicate it multiple times onto one image so that you can see multiples of your sketch, and then you paint on top with different colors and try different color combinations to see what you like. Because if you're going into the final illustration and you don't really have a clear understanding of what colors you're going to do, you're going to get really frustrated. You're going to keep painting over the same areas over and over again. It'll take a lot longer. It could get really frustrating. So this way, you're spending very little time on each color comp, maybe 10 minutes, just to see if you can get colors that work together. And you can compare them to different options. You can see them all at once in front of you, and then make a decision about which one is the color comp that you want to go with. So like I said, you want to take your sketch or your final line art if you've gotten there, and then duplicate it onto the page and then start filling it in with different color combinations. Now, you may end up with colors that are not that different. Like you might like one that you did and then you copy paste it and then you make a few little changes to it. Or you might completely change the colors. Here's another illustration I did. I really only did 2 color comps for this one. Sometimes I get one that I like right away. For that mermaid one that I did, I only did 3 color comps. I had a pretty good idea that I was going to use blues and greens, but I didn't know what combination of those I wanted to use. So this was a way to experiment. And then there was this fade-in illustration where I had no idea what colors I wanted to use. And I tried many strongly different colors. Now, you remember when we did the tonal, when I talked about the tonal one, I said there was a reason this is going to become extra handy for you when it's not just handy for figuring out the lights and darks. When you go to do the color comps, you can copy paste that tonal study multiple times, just like you could if you wanted to just do the line art. And then you can use if you're working digitally, you can use the Photoshop or whatever program you're using in color mode instead of regular mode, so that you're only painting color and it preserves the lightness or darkness of the drawing. So it can speed up this process of painting in colors. Okay, another question from Duskfire. Is it okay to do tonal studying digital or traditional? Both ways to do it are perfectly valid. All of these steps that I'm teaching you, I learned at university, and we did it all traditionally. So with like the color comps, for example, you can take your sketch and photocopy it and then take some matte medium or something and paste it onto illustration board so that you have multiple of these little photocopied sketches on one piece of paper, and then paint on top of it with your medium of choice. So you absolutely can do all of these steps traditionally. The only thing you can't do that I mentioned traditionally is the step of taking your tonal study and using the brush to only paint in color. With acrylic paint, it's opaque. So you're gonna have to mix the paint to the same tone and match the same tone as what's on your tonal study. So you can still photocopy your tonal study and then paint on top of it. In fact, I've done that. Whatever is more comfortable for you, either painting on top of the sketch or painting on top of the tonal study. So by this point, we have not started the final illustration yet, but all the hardest decisions are done. We figured out what the color's gonna be. We figured out what the tones are gonna be. We figured out the composition, the lines, and everything. And now it's just a matter of putting it all together. So I've got steps 9 and 10 on the same slide here. Step 9 is, you probably know this already, you're just painting it in. Filling it in, painting in your colors, putting in the lights and the darks with the colors you picked out from your color comp. And then the final step is you add just a little bit of juice or secret sauce that makes the piece really shine. So on the left, I filled in the colors that I wanted things to be, but it doesn't really have that little sparkle, that little oomph, that little feeling of magic to it. So for me, my magic sauce and my juice is the Color Dodge and Color Burn tool and brushes that add like sparkle effects. So that's my secret sauce. Your secret sauce is going to differ, and you may not even have figured that out yet. This is more style related. You will figure it out over time as you create more art. Your style will start to come out. And I'm going to do actually a separate video just on discovering your art style. Just another reminder, please like and subscribe if you found this video useful. Share it with your friends if you know anyone. Okay, I've gone through the presentation now. Any questions you guys have, I'm here to answer for you. Post in the chat. Post in the chat. Post in the chat. We had a lot of great questions today, actually. How do you shade rocks? That's a great question. How do you shade rocks? So what I would do is let's go back to, step 2 of our process. Research. So if you are working on an illustration that has rocks, and you're not too great at doing rocks, this is the step that you need to be incorporating into your process, which is gather some photos of rocks, maybe even gather some tutorials. You might look for some YouTube tutorials specifically on rocks and see how others approach this. But yeah, you'll have to gather reference and study. That's the next step. Do studies of rocks, practicing rocks on their own in isolation outside of the actual illustration where you wanted to use the rocks. So just focusing on painting rocks, like trying to make them realistic or fit your style or whatever. Cam Kalla says, I'd like to learn more about composition sometime in the future. I always struggle with it because I just want to draw the characters. Then I kind of haphazardly add a background. Yes, I think that would be a great topic. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. If you are not a member of the Paper Demon art community, please check us out. We help artists, neurodivergent artists, get motivated to draw by running an art role-playing game. You draw your character, your original character. You earn loot. You can earn virtual gold, potions, all kinds of items, and it'll help you to defeat art block. Thank you so much for joining me today, everyone. And I will see you at the next stream. And if you would like to join the Paper Demon community, if you're not already a member, links are in the description below to join our community, and we also have a Discord, so definitely check that out. Links are in the description. Thank you so much, everyone.